She was 41 years old, widowed, and standing in the mud outside a depot that no longer wanted her, with $11 sewn into the hem of her coat and nowhere left to sleep that night. Her husband's own brother, a man named Silas Voss, had called him a debt nobody, but him remembered signing, and within a single autumn he had taken her farm, her livestock, and the roof that had sheltered her for 16 years of marriage. All she had left in the world was that hidden $11 in a trunk of her mother's linens. So when the station master mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the railroad was finally clearing out an old, rusted, padlocked boxcar that had sat forgotten on a dead-end siding for 15 years, and that he'd let it go for $4 just to be rid of it, she heard herself say yes before she had even decided to. Folks in town would later call it the most foolish purchase ever made in that county. A blind woman buying a sealed box she could not even open. They did not yet know that inside that car was a secret that had been waiting 15 years to be found. One that would not only change the rest of her life, but would quietly, finally, set right a wrong the whole town had been living inside without ever knowing it. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Adelaide Voss. If you're watching this from a place that feels forgotten tonight, the way that old boxcar was forgotten, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Adelaide had not always been a woman with nothing. She had been raised on the Missouri River, the only daughter of a cooper named Eli Marsh, a quiet, broad-shouldered man who built barrels and crates for the river trade, and who, more than anything else he ever taught her this, that nothing made by human hands was ever truly worthless, only misplaced, only waiting for someone patient enough to see what it still held. He used to walk the riverbank after a flood, picking through the debris that other men stepped over, and more often than not he'd come home with a chair missing one leg, or a chest with a stuck lid, or a crate of nails gone to rust, and within a week he'd have made something whole and useful out of what everyone else had called ruin. Adelaide grew up at his elbow, learning the weight of good oak against bad, learning how to read the grain of a thing and guess its age, learning, too, the careful art of keeping accounts, because her father, though a craftsman, was also meticulous, and he taught her to write a column of figures so clean and honest that a buyer could trust it without ever checking her arithmetic twice. She learned to mend before she learned to mourn, and she carried both lessons with her into womanhood like tools in a satchel she never quite set down. She was 19 when she married Thomas Voss, a gentle, hard-working man from a farming family 2 counties over, and the two of them built a modest but proud wheat operation outside the rail town of Coldwater Junction, a place that had grown up around the tracks in the years after the war and had, by the time Adelaide arrived as a bride, become a town of perhaps 800 souls who depended, in one way or another, on the trains that passed through it. Thomas was not a clever man in the way his older brother Silas was clever, but he was a steady one, and for 16 years the two of them worked their land together, side by side, through droughts and good harvests alike. And though they were never blessed with children of their own, Adelaide came to feel that the farm itself was something she had raised, fence post by fence post, season by season. She kept the books for their small operation, just as her father had taught her, and she was known around Coldwater Junction as a woman whose word and whose figures could both be trusted absolutely, which is a kind of reputation that takes a lifetime to build and, as she would soon learn, can be unmade in a single season by a man determined to unmake it. Silas Voss, Thomas's elder brother, had inherited a very different sort of education from their late father, Augustus Voss, who had been, for many years, the station master of Coldwater Junction itself, a man remembered around town as stern, exacting, and, in the years just after the Great Flood of 1871, when the river had swollen over its banks and torn through half the settlement, as something of a local hero, for it was Augustus who had organized the town's recovery, who had corresponded with relief societies back east, and who had, by all accounts, worked himself half to death trying to rebuild what the water had destroyed. Silas had grown up in his father's shadow, learning not carpentry or farming, but ledgers of a different kind, the kind kept behind a bank counter, and by the time Adelaide married into the family, Silas was already the president of the Coldwater Junction Savings and Loan, a position of considerable influence in a town still small enough that one man's signature could decide the fate of half its families. He had never much cared for his younger brother's quiet contentment with dirt and wheat, and he had certainly never much cared for Adelaide, whom he privately regarded as a woman who had married beneath what little ambition the Voss names still possessed. These were feelings Adelaide had long sensed but never fully understood, until the year everything came apart and she finally learned just how far Silas was willing. Thomas died in the cold spring of 1886, taken by a fever that swept through after a wet planting season, and Adelaide buried him on a hillside within sight of their own wheat fields, believing, in her grief, that whatever else had been taken from her, the land at least remained hers to keep, since the deed had always carried both their names. She did not yet know that 2 years earlier, in a moment of brotherly trust that Thomas had never thought to mention to his wife, he had signed a note with Silas's bank to cover a shared purchase of threshing equipment, using the farm itself as collateral, a debt he had always intended to pay down quietly over time and had, in fact, very nearly finished paying before his death interrupted the arrangement. Within weeks of the funeral, Silas appeared at her door not as a grieving brother, but as a banker, with papers in hand and an expression of practiced regret, informing Adelaide that the remaining balance on the note was due in full, that the bank could not in good conscience extend further credit to a widow with no income of her own, and that the farm would, regretfully, have to be sold to satisfy the debt. Adelaide pleaded for time, offered to work the harvest herself, and pay what she could, even offered to sign over a portion of the acreage to settle the matter. But Silas was, as she would later understand far better than she did then, not a man interested in being repaid so much as a man interested in being rid of a reminder of his quieter, kinder brother. By the end of that summer, the farm was sold at auction, purchased, as it happened, by a cousin of Silas's wife, for a price that left Adelaide with almost nothing once the note was cleared, and Adelaide Voss found herself, at 41, standing on the platform of the very depot her father-in-law had once run, with a trunk of linens, a few personal effects, and $11 hidden in the hem of her coat. Because she had learned, in the months of dealing with Silas's lawyers, not to trust banks with anything she could not afford to lose. She took a room above the seamstress's shop for a few weeks, mending and taking in laundry to make a little money stretch. And it was during this time, while walking the rail yard one gray October afternoon, simply to think, that she fell into conversation with the station master, a kindly, overworked man named Hollis Pratt, who mentioned, almost in passing, that the railroad company had finally authorized him to clear out a derelict boxcar that had been sitting on the old dead spur behind the freight house since before he'd even taken the job. A relic, he said, from the flood years, sealed shut with a padlock so rusted that nobody had bothered trying to open it in living memory, and condemned now to be broken up for scrap lumber and iron. He named a price almost apologetically, $4, just enough to cover the paperwork of transferring ownership off the railroad's books, and joked that he doubted even the wood inside was worth salvaging after sitting closed up so long. Adelaide, who had nowhere to live and no roof of her own, and who had spent her whole life believing, the way her father had taught her, that nothing was ever truly worthless, heard herself agree before she had even walked the length of the car to look at it properly. Folks who saw her hand over 4 crumpled dollars for a rusted, abandoned railcar she could not even unlock thought her grief had finally turned to madness. And perhaps, for a moment, even she wondered the same thing, standing there in the cold with the wind cutting through her thin coat, looking up at the rust-streaked iron and the padlock that had not turned in 15 years. It took her 3 days and the help of a blacksmith named Otto Fenwick, who agreed to cut the ancient padlock for the price of a hot meal, before the boxcar's heavy door finally groaned open on hinges that screamed in protest, releasing a breath of stale, dry air that smelled faintly of old canvas and older dust. Inside, the car was darker than Adelaide had expected, the small high windows nearly opaque with grime. But as her eyes adjusted, she saw that it was not, as she had feared, simply an empty, rusted shell. It had been packed, once, and packed with some care, with crates stacked along both walls, their stenciled markings faded but still legible if she leaned close. Seed grain, agricultural implements, medical supplies. And on several of the larger crates, a phrase that made her breath catch in her throat, for the relief of Coldwater Junction, with a date she could just make out beneath the grime. 1871. She knew, as did every old family in town, the story of the Great Flood, and she knew, too, vaguely, that relief goods had been sent from charitable societies back east in its aftermath, though the town had always understood that much of that aid had simply been lost in the chaos of the disaster, swept away, or never properly accounted for in the confusion of those terrible weeks. Standing in the cold half-light of that sealed car, Adelaide began, slowly, to understand that what she had bought for $4 was not scrap lumber at all, but something the whole town had been told, for 15 years, no longer existed. She did not tell anyone at first, partly from caution and partly because she herself did not yet know what she had found, and she spent the better part of a week quietly working through the car by lamplight after her laundry chores were done, prying open crates with a borrowed hammer, cataloging what she found the way her father had taught her, in a clean, honest column of figures in a notebook she had bought for a few cents at the mercantile. Most of the crates held exactly what their stenciling promised: bags of seed grain gone hard and useless after 15 years, hand tools rusted nearly solid, bolts of cloth eaten through by moths and damp, ordinary relief supplies that time had simply ruined, the kind of loss that explained itself and asked no further questions. But it was in prying loose a stubborn floor panel near the rear of the car, one she'd noticed sat slightly higher than the others, that Adelaide found what would change everything. A shallow compartment built beneath the false floor, clearly added after the car's original construction, and inside it, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle with age, a small tin dispatch box, and beside it a child's single leather shoe, no bigger than her palm, and a slim, leather-bound ledger whose cover bore in careful copperplate hand the name A. Voss. Adelaide sat back on her heels in that dim, dusty car for a long while before she found the courage to open the ledger, because she had already begun to suspect, with a cold feeling settling somewhere beneath her ribs, exactly whose initial that it belonged to. And she was right. The ledger had belonged to Augustus Voss, Thomas and Silas's father. The station master remembered around Coldwater Junction as the tireless hero of the flood recovery, and its pages, written in the same meticulous hand that had once kept the depot's official freight records, told a story altogether different from the one the town had been telling itself for 15 years. The relief car, Adelaide read, had in fact arrived safely in Coldwater Junction only days after the floodwaters receded, fully loaded with the goods that Eastern charitable societies and church congregations had raised for the town's recovery, including, the ledger made plain in entries that grew increasingly cramped and hurried, as if written in private haste, a strong box of donated gold and silver coin, nearly $4,000 in value, collected specifically to fund the rebuilding of the town school, its small church, and its public well, all three of which had been destroyed in the flood. But rather than unloading and distributing this aid, Augustus Voss had quietly diverted the car onto the dead spur behind the freight house, reported to both the railroad company and the relief societies that the shipment had been lost in flood-damaged track further downriver, and had, over the following months, slowly removed the strong box's contents for his own use, while leaving the bulk of the ordinary supplies sealed inside the car, perhaps from guilt, perhaps simply because removing everything would have invited questions he could not afford to answer. The final entries in the ledger, dated only weeks before Augustus's own death some years later, were less an accounting of goods than something closer to a confession, written, it seemed, to no one in particular, in which the old stationmaster admitted that he had told himself at first he meant only to borrow against the gold to cover a debt of his own and return it, and that one delay had become another until the lie had simply become too large to undo, and that he had, in the end, chosen to let the car sit forgotten rather than face what unsealing it would mean for his name, his sons, and the town that had once called him a hero. Adelaide sat for a very long time with that ledger open across her knees, the small leather shoe resting forgotten beside her, understanding all at once that the comfortable fortune which had allowed Silas Voss to build a fine brick house on the hill, to fund the savings and loan that had since foreclosed on half the struggling farms in the county, including her own, and to sit on the town council with an air of inherited respectability, had its roots not in honest enterprise, but in a theft committed against the very town that trusted him, a theft from grieving, flood-ravaged families who had never received the school, the church repairs, or the clean well water that strangers far away had given their hard-earned dollars to provide. The child's shoe, she would later learn from Old Town records, had likely belonged to one of 3 children lost in the original flood, a detail that struck her harder, somehow, than even the gold, because it told her this was never simply a matter of money but of a debt owed to grief itself, a debt 15 years overdue. For a few days, Adelaide told no one, turning the ledger over and over in her mind, weighing what it meant that the proof of this old theft now sat in her possession, purchased for $4 from a railroad eager to be rid of an inconvenient old car, by a woman that very thief's own son had only months before stripped of her home and her name. She thought of going straight to the town council, but she had learned enough in her dealings with Silas's lawyers to know that an accusation without ironclad proof would simply be dismissed as the bitterness of a grieving widow, and that Silas, with his standing and his connections to the railroad company itself, would move quickly and quietly to discredit her and seize whatever remained of the evidence before she could make it public. So instead, carefully, methodically, the way her father had taught her to verify a thing before ever speaking its worth aloud, she began cross-referencing the ledger's entries against old issues of the Coldwater Junction Courier she found at the newspaper office. The Relief Society's own published acknowledgement of funds raised, which a kindly clerk helped her locate by writing to the Society's offices back east, and against the town's own incomplete and conveniently vague records of what aid had actually been received and distributed after the flood. Each piece confirmed what the ledger claimed, and slowly, over the better part of a month, Adelaide assembled not merely a suspicion but a case. It was during this quiet period of gathering proof that word inevitably reached Silas Voss that the widow of his late brother had purchased the old relief car from the railroad, and his response, when it came, told Adelaide everything she still needed to know about how much he understood was at stake. He arrived at the seamstress's shop one evening, his manner pleasant on the surface in the way of a man accustomed to controlling every room he entered, and offered, with what he no doubt believed was generosity, to purchase the boxcar back from her for $50, framing it as a kindness to a struggling widow burdened with a useless piece of railroad junk. When Adelaide, with careful politeness, declined, his tone shifted, and he reminded her, not quite as a threat but close enough to one, that the car and its contents had technically been railroad property until her recent purchase, and that any goods found inside legally belonged to her only insofar as the bill of sale specified. A bill of sale, he suggested, not very subtly, could perhaps be challenged in court by a bank with rather more resources than a seamstress's lodger. Adelaide thanked him for his concern and showed him to the door, and that night she sat awake a long while, understanding that she had very little time before Silas, unable to buy his way out of the problem, would attempt some other means of making it disappear, whether by legal maneuvering, by quietly pressuring Hollis Pratt to claim the sale had been improperly conducted, or simply by spreading enough doubt around town that anything Adelaide eventually said would be dismissed as the ravings of a bitter, broke widow with a grudge against her late husband's family. In the days that followed, Adelaide felt the town's mood shift subtly against her, the way Silas had no doubt intended. The grocer who had always greeted her warmly grew suddenly cool. A few of the women she had sewn for began finding excuses to take their mending elsewhere, and Hollis Pratt himself, clearly uneasy and clearly aware that his job depended in part on the goodwill of the bank that held the railroad's local accounts, came to her quietly to say that perhaps it would be best, given the talk going around, if the matter of the old boxcar were simply left alone. A rumor began circulating, one she could trace easily enough back to the bank's own clerks, that the widow Voss had grown unstable in her grief, that she had taken to spending her evenings alone in a derelict railcar, muttering over old papers, and that whatever she claimed to have found there was more likely the product of a lonely woman's imagination than of any real document. It was a cruel rumor precisely because it was so plausible, precisely because it asked the town to believe nothing more sinister than that sorrow had finally worn down a woman who had already lost so much, and Adelaide understood, walking home past neighbors who now lowered their eyes rather than meet hers, that this was a far more dangerous weapon than any lawyer's letter, for it required no proof at all, only enough whispered doubt to make people prefer comfortable silence to uncomfortable truth. One evening, returning from the courthouse with the Relief Society's letter freshly folded in her coat pocket, she found the boxcar's door standing ajar. The new padlock Otto Fenwick had fitted for her lying snapped on the ground beside it, and for one cold moment she feared the worst, that someone had come in the night to remove or destroy whatever evidence still remained inside. But a careful search by lamplight showed nothing missing, only the crates disturbed as though someone had searched through them in haste and frustration, looking, she suspected, for the very ledger she had already removed and kept hidden beneath the floorboards of her rented room days before. She said nothing of the break-in to anyone but Otto, who fitted a heavier lock the following morning and refused, gruffly, to accept payment for it, telling her only that his own mother had nearly lost her home to the bank some years back over a debt he'd always privately suspected was not quite honest, and that he, for one, intended to see this through to whatever end it found. Adelaide understood, in that moment, exactly how isolated and unprotected she truly was, a widow with no family of her own remaining nearby, no money beyond what little she had managed to save from her laundry work, and an accusation of theft and fraud against the most powerful man in town resting entirely on documents that he could very plausibly claim she had forged or misrepresented out of spite. It would have been easy, in the face of all this, to quietly sell whatever salvageable goods remained in the car, pocket whatever small sum they brought, and let the matter of Augustus Voss's old sins sink back into the silence it had occupied for 15 years. But Adelaide thought of the little leather shoe, and of the school that had never been rebuilt properly, the town instead making do for years with a cramped, leaking schoolhouse that every family complained about and no one could afford to replace, and of the well that still ran brackish on the east side of town because the funds to dig a proper new one had simply never materialized after the flood, and she found that she could not, in good conscience, let it go. So instead of retreating, Adelaide did the one thing her father had always told her mattered most when the truth of a thing was being doubted. She made her accounting so clear, so honest, and so thoroughly documented that no reasonable person could dismiss it without first dismissing the evidence itself. She wrote a careful, detailed letter to the Relief Society back east, enclosing copies of the relevant ledger pages and asking them to confirm, in writing, the amount and nature of the aid they had originally sent to Coldwater Junction in 1871, and within 3 weeks she received back not only their confirmation, but copies of their own original shipping manifest, which matched Augustus Voss's ledger almost line for line. She visited the county courthouse, and, with the help of a sympathetic young clerk who remembered her father-in-law's reputation rather differently than most, located the original property records showing that the dead spur on which the car had sat was, in fact, railroad land leased to the town itself for storage, meaning the car's contents had always, technically, belonged to Coldwater Junction's relief fund rather than to the railroad or to Augustus Voss personally, a detail that closed off any legal claims Silas might have attempted to make, and she requested, formally and in writing, that the town council hold an open session to review the matter, a request that, once the Relief Society's own letter had arrived and become known around town, Silas found considerably harder to quietly suppress than he had perhaps expected. The council meeting was held on a cold evening in the schoolhouse itself, the same cramped, leaking schoolhouse the original relief funds had been meant to replace, with nearly every family in Coldwater Junction crowded onto its narrow benches, drawn less by official notice than by the rumor, by then impossible to fully contain, that the widow Voss had found something extraordinary in that old boxcar, and that it somehow concerned the Voss family's own fortune. Adelaide stood at the front of that humble room, in the same plain coat she had worn the day she bought the car, and laid out her case plainly, without embellishment, the way her father had taught her to present any honest accounting. The ledger in Augustus Voss's own unmistakable hand, the Relief Society's confirming letter, the original shipping manifest. The property records proving the car's contents belonged not to any private party, but to the town's own long-lost relief fund. She did not accuse Silas of anything beyond what the documents themselves plainly showed, and she did not ask for vengeance, only for what was owed, that whatever remained of the original gold and silver, along with the value of the goods themselves, be restored to the town's use, exactly as the original donors back east had always intended. Silas, present in the room and growing visibly pale as page after page was read aloud, attempted at first to dismiss the ledger as a forgery, but the Relief Society's own letter, bearing their official seal and matching his late father's entries detail for detail, left him very little ground to stand on. And when an elderly farmer near the back of the room, a man named Caleb Hutton who had lost his own young daughter in the flood, rose unsteadily to ask in a trembling voice whether that small leather shoe Adelaide had described might be his daughter's, the room fell into a silence so complete that everyone present understood, without needing it spoken aloud, that whatever Silas might still try to claim, the town had already decided where the truth lay. In the weeks that followed, the strong box itself, which Adelaide, working with the council, located still partially intact inside Augustus Voss's old private office safe at the bank, a safe Silas had inherited along with the building and had apparently never fully emptied, was opened in the presence of the full council and found to contain a portion of the original gold and silver coin, considerably diminished from the ledger's original accounting, but still substantial, along with several promissory notes in Augustus's hand that made plain where the remainder had gone over the years, much of it, it turned out, having quietly funded the very bank building Silas now occupied. Faced with documentation no court in the territory would have allowed him to argue away, and with the town now fully aware of exactly how his family's comfortable position had been built, Silas chose not to fight the council's ruling that the recovered funds, along with restitution drawn from the bank's own assets to cover what could not be recovered, be placed immediately into a trust for the long-promised rebuilding of the schoolhouse, the repair of the small church, and the digging, at long last, of a proper deep well on the town's eastern side. He resigned, within the month, from both the bank presidency and his council seat, not formally disgraced in any legal sense, for Adelaide had never sought to ruin him, only to right what his father had wronged, but quietly diminished in every way that mattered in a town as small and close as Coldwater Junction, where a man's standing depends entirely on the trust of his neighbors, and where that trust, once broken so plainly, does not easily mend itself again. It was old Caleb Hutton, the farmer whose daughter had drowned in the original flood, who came to Adelaide a final time, some weeks after the council's ruling, carrying the small leather shoe she had returned to him, now wrapped carefully in a clean square of cloth, to tell her that he intended to bury it properly beside his daughter's grave on the hillside, something he had never been able to do when her small body was recovered without it so many years before. He thanked Adelaide not for the money, which he said meant little to him now at his age, but for the simple fact that someone had finally cared enough to look closely at what the rest of the town had agreed, long ago, to stop asking questions about. Construction on the new schoolhouse began that same spring, built of good solid lumber rather than the patched, leaking boards the old building had made do with for so long, and the well, dug at last to a depth that reached clean water, was fitted with a hand pump that the school children took to calling, half in jest and half in genuine gratitude, the Widow's Well, a name that stuck around Coldwater Junction long after most people had stopped telling the story of exactly how it came to be paid. 4. Adelaide herself asked for nothing from the recovered fortune beyond what she had already spent restoring the boxcar's salvageable goods to usefulness, though the council, over her own quiet protests, insisted on awarding her a modest finder's portion in recognition of what her honesty and patience had returned to the town, a sum just sufficient, in the end, to allow her to purchase a small house near the schoolhouse she had helped finally see rebuilt, and to set herself up with a modest dressmaking shop of her own rather than continuing to take in others' mending from a rented room. It was a much smaller fortune than the one Silas had quietly enjoyed for 15 years, But it was hers honestly, built on the same principle her father had taught her on the muddy banks of the Missouri so many years before, that nothing was ever truly worthless, only waiting for someone patient enough to see what it still held. So when we tell you that a 41-year-old widow named Adelaide Voss paid $4 for a locked, abandoned railroad car that no one in Coldwater Junction had been able to open in 15 years, we are not telling you a story about luck or even, really, about treasure. We are telling you about a woman who had been cast out by the very family that should have protected her, who arrived at that rusted boxcar with almost nothing left to her name, and who chose, even then, to look closely at what everyone else had already decided was worthless. The gold inside that car mattered less, in the end, than the choice Adelaide made once she understood what she had truly found. The choice to use a stolen fortune not to settle her own grievance, not to enrich herself at her enemy's expense, but to finally give a grieving, overlooked town the school, the church, and the clean water that had been promised to it and stolen from it 15 years before. That is the kind of justice that does not arrive with anger, but with patience and a clean column of honest figures and a willingness to see value where everyone else has already looked away. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Adelaide's story tonight. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need a reminder that overlooked things and overlooked people are so often worth a second look. We'd love to know, in the comments below, what is a time in your own life when you found real value in something or in someone that everyone else had already written off? We read every one of your stories, and we're always glad to have you with us. Until next time, stay close.